Have you ever wanted to make just a good study model that you could actually do a mock surgery on, whether it's for you, whether it's for a first-time implant placer that wants to get a practice run, or maybe it's for models for courses? Well, that's what we're going to cover today in this video, so if you're interested, stick around. Thanks. Hey, what's up everybody? This is Dr. Corey Glenn, and I'm going to make a kind of a weird video today. A friend of mine, Dr. Gerald Bozeman, who's a faculty member at University of Utah School of Dentistry, he is doing a project with some students on dental implant placement. And so one of the things they were hoping to do as part of this is actually generate some, as lifelike as possible models of the patient's jaw that have the roots, that allows them to essentially do the entire mock surgery into this model. And so that's what I'm going to be doing. This is really a video dedicated to just Gerald, but I thought, heck, maybe someone will get something out of it. So the prerequisites for doing this, at least in the way I'm going to show you, you're going to need an intraoral scan of the patient. Obviously, you need a CT scan of the patient. And what I've done is I've taken that CT scan and I have run it through DiagnaCat, which is an AI-driven bone segmentation process. And as part of that process, it's going to segment the bone. So you'll get a mandible or a maxilla with its sockets, but you'll also get the roots of the teeth segmented. Okay, so for starters, I'm going to go ahead and open up this mandible, but those are really the three pieces of data that we would need. All right, so here you see the mandible, and for whatever reason, one of the teeth didn't segment off. So yeah, it segmented it, but I don't know why, but it's just part of this STL. So all I've done is select that entire tooth, and now I'm going to hit Y on the keyboard. Y is the hotkey for separate, and now you see that's a standalone tooth. I'm also going to go to import and bring in that intraoral scan and the other roots. So control select both of those, bring them in. And let's hide that intraoral scan for just a moment. So for whatever reason, again, this one root got left out, so I'm just going to combine it back in. So I've got both of these models in the object browser, control select both of them, combine. All right, now that's all one STL. So what we're going to need to do for starters is we've got this intraoral scan, right? And so we need to turn this thing into a solid model. All right, so for starters, I'd like to get a smoother boundary on this because we're going to basically end up closing this in. So what I'm going to do is select it all. Now I could do that by just selecting it all, double click it, or you can just hit Control A and that selects everything. Then I can hit B or come up here to Deform Smooth. I'm sorry, no, Modify. And you see here B, this is smooth boundary. Smooth would smooth the entire STL out, which you don't really want to do here. Okay, so now at least we've got a relatively smooth boundary. If you've got any little ragged edges, you can always use your select tool and just come in and chop that down. And then we've smoothed it again. All right, so I would like this to sit a little bit above the bone. And so I'm going to take the time to trim this back. I don't need all of this gingiva. In fact, I don't need very much of it at all. The only reason for the gingiva here is that if this is going to be lifelike, like you're doing it on a patient, you're going to design a guide on something that has a little bit of the gingiva. So typically I'll make my guides stop at about the CEJs of the teeth. And so I'm going just a little bit below that, and I'm going to cut off all the tissue beyond that point. All right, so I can just delete that. Don't worry about those little bits and pieces at the moment. We'll take care of those shortly. And I'm going to do the same thing on the lingual, just a little below the gingival margins. Delete that. Now you've got these little floating bits. This is what I want to keep. All right, so a lot of what I do in Mesh Mixer, you'll see I use hotkeys, but all of this stuff is found, like for example, if I wanted to select all of this model, I could go to Modify, Select All, but that's Control A, right? That's select everything. If I wanted to just select this portion of the mesh, I could double click it, which excludes those other little floating bits, or I could just click on this mesh and go to Expand to Connected. That's E. All right. Now I want to keep that and get rid of everything else. Again, under Modify, there's Invert or I, and so that deselects your current selection and selects everything else. So now all those floating bits are selected. I'm going to hit Delete. All right. So now we have this. Once again, I'm going to smooth the boundary. Okay, so that's step one. So we need to make this into a solid model, okay? And normally if I was doing that, I would just select the boundary and I'd pull this down and then I'd plane cut across it and I'd have a solid model. But, excuse me, but I really don't want to do that here because I'm trying to keep the crest of bone intact where it's visible. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of close this straight across. All right, so what's a different approach we could take to do that? Well, I could just maybe select a portion there. I could select a portion right here. So you see how I've grabbed a little portion of each of those boundaries? And under Edit, you see Bridge or Control B. So when I hit Control B, you see what's happened. That has bridged that together. And I'm going to just do that in several spots here. I could even just lasso a portion of that boundary, Control B. Control B. I don't really need all of that gingiva, so I'm going to just cut that away. Control B. Now I know this area is going to give me a problem, because watch what happens if I do this. Just due to the topography of this gingiva, if I go from there to there and I bridge it, you see what happens? Like, because that's so flat, it's actually passing through itself. So that's not ideal. So in just this isolated area, here's what I'm going to do instead. First of all, I know that won't be a problem through right here. So that I'm going to bridge. Okay. Now I could just select the boundary of this one hole that I've created. You see what I've done is basically break this into sections, each section having its own boundaries. I just hit W on the keyboard, which turns on the wireframe. And I'm only doing this because this is kind of a unique scenario right here. But I can double click that boundary, and as long as I click one of the edge triangles or double click it, then that just selects the boundary. All right, I'll smooth it. All right, B, and then I'm going to transform, so that's T on the keyboard, and I'm just going to pull it down a hair. Doesn't take much at all. I just want to do enough that now I actually have something I can bridge between without it passing through itself. So right there, Control B, and now we have something we can work with. Okay, so let's solidify this model. Turn the wireframe off. I hit W on the keyboard. Let's just close this in. So Analysis, Inspector, let's do a flat fill. Alrighty. And, you know, I'm looking here, we've still got a decent amount of space above the bone. And so one thing I could do if I wanted to, it's not necessary, but I'm picky, so I'm going to, is you see how I'm just click on all these face groups, and even though I've only selected a couple of triangles in each of them, these are broken into what's called face groups. So if I hit G, that's expand to face groups. It's under this, right? Expand to groups. Okay, so if that's a little ragged looking, I can just, again, I always like to smooth stuff and then pull that down just a hair. I'll accept it. And then heck, while I've got this selected, I'm going to just select all of these boundaries. Now, when you've got a lot of face groups like this, sometimes it's easier to select the one face group that you aren't dealing with, right? So that's the business end of the intraoral scan, and then hit I. That's invert again. And then let's just do a smooth on that. And then we can increase or decrease the smoothing scale, but that's a little bit more along the lines of what I'm after. And if you have, you know, something like this where that was kind of a sharp edge transition, we could either just use some smoothing tools and manually smooth that up, or you could, I mean, there's a number of ways you could deal with that, but probably beyond the scope of this video. All right, so we've got this. Now here's what I'd like to do. One of the problems when you do CT segmentation of teeth, generally the roots are going to be extremely accurate. The crowns of the teeth, not so much. You know, this is a PFM. You see the scatter that was generated, so that part sticking through there is really not the teeth. I mean, the teeth here are accurately represented by the intraoral scan. So what I would ideally like to do is take everything that is above this transition where it joins into this model, everything above that, as far as crowns of the segmented roots, I just want to get rid of them. Okay, now I can do that in a number of ways. Let me do it both ways, and you can just pick which one you like. I could select the roots, and I could just manually come in and cut those out. All right, make sure you're not picking up any portion of that root. If you were, like let's say if I extend it here, hold shift on your keyboard, and now your select tool becomes erase. And I could delete that and repair it, or I could maybe even hit F. F is erase and fill. Okay, and I'm just looking to see that I no longer have that any portion of the segmentation sticking through into the crown. So that works. You could do that one by one on all these teeth. If you don't mind being a little more advanced in the way you tackle this, then we could take another approach. All right, we've got all of this bottom of this model as a face group. Okay, so what I could do is take this. All right, I've selected it. Now what would happen if I went to edit and offset? All right, so you see, right, it's going to default to whatever the last offset distance you used was, and at the moment that's set at 0.3. So do you see what it does? It just takes that same surface, grows it outward by 0.3 or whatever number you stick in there. But in this case, if I do that, I'm going to have a gap in between my model and these roots that I can't combine together. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to offset it by a negative 0.3, 0.5, or whatever you want to use. And then hit enter, let it refigure. Okay, so it still did the operation, but I can't see it right now because again, now it has offset that internally. It's gone internal into the model. So just accept it. Okay. And what you should have now is a new mesh. So if I were to select, you know, all of this outer mesh and then hit Y again, which is separate, look what I have now when I hide that. I've got just this. All right. And then I could go ahead and select that offset distance. Now I know this is going to be a problem here because that is not going all the way through. So easy fix is just to select a portion of it, T for transform, pull it out a little bit, just so that that's penetrating through that entire model. All right, I'm going to select it all, and then again, a zillion ways you could do this. I'm going to just hit D. D is extrude. It's under that edit menu, and I'm going to extrude this upward by whatever amount. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so now I have a solid object, and I could select these roots, and I could subtract this object from it. Now I anticipate this is going to fail, and let's just give it a try, and I'll tell you why that is. So always select the object you want to subtract from first in your objects browser, and now Control, select what you want to subtract, Boolean difference. And actually it worked. I'll show you why I didn't think it would. I didn't expect it to, because you see how this has got holes in its mesh? A lot of times when you do Boolean functions, having holes in the mesh is going to impair that. So typically it's a good idea to repair your models first and then do it, despite the fact that it did work the first time. So Boolean difference, and you see it's basically deleted all of the roots except for what was, penetrating through, but that's okay. I'm going to accept it. And now what I can do, just these parts of the roots is what I want to keep. So I'm going to click on each of them, and then E, expand to connected. That's what I want to keep. So I invert and delete. Now I've gotten rid of all of those. And now you see this, okay? And if I was to look internal here, you see that those roots actually penetrate up into this a little bit, and that's important for this next step. So at this point, what I'm going to do is hit Control select both of those, but now I want to do a Boolean union. Don't do combine, because that's not going to be exactly what we want. We want to do a Boolean union, which makes this all one watertight mesh, as opposed to just two STLs superimposed over one another, but really they're still two distinct surfaces. And there you see we have now a watertight model. So when I say watertight, what I mean by that is that, let's look if we cut right through this. You see how that's all one piece? There's no separate surfaces between these two models. They are all one watertight model, okay? So that's probably the hardest part of this process, all right? And now we have this mandible. I do see there's one little error in the mesh right there by that red dot, and so always a good idea to run your inspector and just repair any holes. Another good idea is go ahead and save this as a project, and so I'm going to call this jaw project. It's almost an instantaneous save, so you don't have to sit there and wait on it or anything. All right, so here was my thought when I was trying to think how they could make some really nice lifelike models is, it would be nice if they could print this jaw out of something in bone that would be soft enough to drill through without chewing up your drills. But one of his requests was I'd like to be able to see those roots, so that they get an idea of like where the adjacent anatomy is, so that they can appreciate that when they're setting up their angulation and everything. So we'll go through some of that later, but the way that I came up with doing that is basically I'm going to have to make this where I can print all of this in one solid piece, let's say out of Crown and Bridge resin, okay, or any white resin that would look like teeth. And then this all as one piece needs to be able to drop into this mandible. Now this mandible currently has sockets, but as you can imagine, when I'm looking down into these sockets, I have undercuts. I can't see them everywhere. Okay, so how am I going to make that where this can all drop in simultaneously? That's going to be the next step. Okay, so in order to do that, I really need to create a path of draw over these roots, okay? So I'm going to do that in Blue Sky. You could also do it in Mesh Mixer, I'm sorry, in Exocad, 3Shape, but Blue Sky is something most people seem to have. So I'm going to go to Import Models. We're not even really dealing with a CT in this case. And I'm going to go to my documents. There it is. Oh, I haven't saved this yet, so I got to do that first. This is all a new STL that I don't have, so let's export it and call this combined teeth or combined iOS and roots. All right, now into Blue Sky. Import models. And let's pull in that combined intraoral scan and roots. Okay, so it's pulled in the model. This first step, what Blue Sky is wanting me to do is to set my alignment. Now, if I do this, remember every CAD program has its own definition of what's up, what's down, what's left, what's right. It has its own coordinate system. And so Blue Sky is essentially asking me to align this to its coordinate system. But if I do that, and then let's say I generate this path of draw, save it, when I pull it back in, it's out of orientation now with where those models originally were. So what I want to do here is just skip the alignment entirely because I don't want to change any of that. And as you can see, because this came off of a CT, it's already somewhat oriented properly to this. And so now I've got this open in Blue Sky. All I need to do is create a path of draw on it. Easiest place to do that is in the denture module. Because if you've ever used Blue Sky Plan, you know the first step of designing a denture is to indicate your path of draw, and then it gives you the option. Do you want to block out the undercuts? Do you not want to block out the undercuts? You know, so forth. So that's what we're going to do here. So you got to think a little abstract right now. This has to insert this way into the mandible, okay? So what I really need is a path of draw looking from this direction. I want to indicate a path of draw from this direction and block out any undercuts that may be present. All right, hopefully you're following that. So this is a mandibular model, right? But you got to think of this in terms of we're tricking the software right now. We're telling it that we're making a denture, even though we're really not. We're just trying to do that to get to that step of creating a blockout. Okay, so think about this. If you were looking at a maxillary denture model, you would be going from this direction. So, you know, if I wanted to block out undercuts from this direction, cool. I'll just say it's a mandible and move forward. But since I'm doing it from this direction, that's oriented more like a maxillary model. It's a little tricky there. So I'm going to trick the software and tell it I'm going to make a maxillary denture. Now, one other thing, you can't start the denture process. Watch, if I hit this, it says there's no maxillary teeth chain because I haven't put any teeth. So what am I making a denture to? So I'm going to have to go up here, add some teeth. I only need, you know, at least 2 teeth. So I'm going to just grab 2 upper teeth because again, think of the direction. We're trying to make a maxillary quote denture. Okay, and then control, drop those in anywhere as long as they're oriented properly to the head. And now I can go ahead and proceed. We're going to tell it I'm making a maxillary denture over this, and let's say create a denture. Here's what I was after. All right, so now I just want to think about how do I want to drop these teeth in? And I'm going to kind of get, you know, the best angle on a path of draw that I can, more or less looking straight down on it. And then I want to tell it to set my insertion direction from this view. Don't try to mess with the arrows and all that. Just set it from your view. Now my insertion direction is indicated from this view. All that brown is the undercuts, and you see, right? All that brown, when I look from this direction, no wonder, right? It's all undercut in that area. if I actually want this thing to go into the mandible, I can't allow any undercuts. So take that to 0, and we've already set the insertion direction. Now let's click next. This is all I was after. So at this point, I don't need those teeth. I just want to export this model. So File, Export Data. And in that same folder, I'm going to call this Root Path of Draw. And now I'm done in Blue Sky. I don't have to save this or anything. I'm done. Okay. So let's look at this. Import Root Path of Draw. Because I didn't do that alignment step in Blue Sky, you see how this pulls right back into alignment? And it perfectly coincides with my roots, except for it's blocked out all those undercuts. So now you can imagine if I subtract this from this mandible, now I have a mandible that I can insert all of these roots into. Okay. Now this may be overcomplicating this for most people. I'm doing it this way because that's kind of how they specified it. They wanted to see the roots through the bone model. And that is a good way to do it, although a little bit more complicated. So let's now think about making these sockets. So when I look from this direction, I can look down in here. I see everything that, if I subtract this from the mandible, I see everything it's going to take away. But now it's a little more complicated than that. There's no offset spacer. If you've ever printed two things, imagine you're printing a two-piece denture, right? You've got the teeth in white and the pink in, or the gingiva in pink. If you have no offset spacer between those, the two parts are not going to seat together, because as accurate as printing is, there's a 50 to 100 micron discrepancy, and unless you create a little slop space, think of it like cement spacer in your crown, those two parts are not going to fit together properly. So before I do this, what I want to do is offset this entire surface by just a little bit. I would say 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters, depending on the accuracy of your printer. So that's what I'm going to do here. All right, so let's offset this. I'm going to hit Control A, which selects all of this surface, and then go to Edit, Offset, and I want to offset it by a positive, let's say 0.25. So I'm going to change this. Remember, it's always going to default to whatever you last did your offset with. Right now, since it's at negative 0.3, you see it's created this new surface internal. That doesn't do me any good. I want to go a positive 0.25 millimeters. Hit enter, let it refigure. And now you see it's essentially grown this entire surface outward by 0.25 millimeters. And so I'll accept that. Now once you do an offset, then the newly offset surface is always still going to be selected. While it's still selected, go ahead and hit Y on your keyboard. Now you have two independent STLs, the original and now the newly offset surface. All right, so we only want to deal with this newly offset surface. And this is what we can now subtract from the mandible. Now I did just think of one issue, which is we're not going to go to the trouble of simulating gingiva. I mean, we could do that, but that's a lot of trouble. It's really not necessary. And so I really would like to cut away this portion. Let's act like this is the implant in question where they're going to do their simulated implant placement. All right. So I don't want to subtract anything right in this area. Really, it's only the roots I'm after. So what I'm going to do real quick before I do this subtraction is go to Analysis, Inspector. I'm going to fix this hole. All right, so now I've closed in that hole. And what I can do now is just do a plane cut right through that area. Because again, I want to leave this all intact bone. I don't want to subtract anything, nothing like that. So under Edit, Plane Cut, All right, it's going to default. So first I'm going to plane cut right here. If you didn't draw a good line, you can just redo it. Okay, now you're going to learn a lot of Mesh Mixer in this video. If I just accept this, right now it's set to discard this half. If I wanted to switch it, now it's going to discard this half. I really don't want to do either of those, okay? Because I want to keep this, and we're going to do another plane cut here, and I want to keep this. So what I would suggest you do is right now just say keep both. All right. Now it looks like nothing has happened there, but if I double click this, these are two independent surfaces now that are broken apart. I could even hit Control G and assign a face group to it. Okay, let's do the exact same thing right here. Edit, plane cut. So I'm going to get it where I can see here. And once again, it doesn't matter which direction if we tell it we want to keep both halves. So I'll accept that. All right. So this is all still technically one STL, but it's really now made up of 3 parts, and I want to discard this central part. That would have probably have been easier if I'd have done that, you know, back in the intraoral scan stage and just deleted all that gingiva, but so be it, whatever. You got to learn some freebie Mesh Mixer tips. So now we're ready. And that's going to leave this mandible completely intact right here in the site where that implant's going to go. All right, so let's click on the mandible. Remember, anytime you're going to subtract an object from another object, that's a Boolean difference. Select first the object you're subtracting from, and then control select whatever you're subtracting. Boolean difference. And hopefully it works the first time, but it didn't. So we get more Mesh Mixer learning opportunities. Okay, so let's cancel that. It doesn't like something here. So this is going to be a learning opportunity in why sometimes these Boolean functions don't work. I'm going to open up a hole here just so you can look into it. And do you see that? Probably help if I turn on this wireframe. So whenever I did that, you saw there was a red line, or it'll be a blue line, pointing to some aspect of this that Boolean operation failed. And it doesn't like this because here we are, we're trying to subdivide and subtract that tiny little surface, and the software just doesn't know how to remesh it, right? It's got this little tiny perforation right at where a bunch of these triangles from the other object join together. So, you know, the way I would deal with that is I would just on my mandible, okay, I've selected the mandible, I could just inflate that a little bit, right? So I'm looking at it, I'm going to go to my brushes, and I'm going to choose inflate. Pretty small spot size, and just one click, you see I inflated that, and that thing goes away. Now I bet you when we try this, it's going to work just fine. So inspector, I'll fill that, although it's probably not critical. So mandible, control select, Boolean difference. And there you have it. You can see a little better with the wireframe not on. So this represents a mandible with sockets, but they're sockets that are that have a built-in path of draw, so that this overall piece here that I've created can seat in there. Okay, so again, imagine this mandible's clear. Right, we'll print that in a clear resin, and then this we could print in whatever color, white, gray, model resin, doesn't matter. But this has got a little bit of spacer around it, so this should passively drop in there. And the way I'll bond these two together is I'll I'll just take some of after this mandible's printed, I'll take some of the same resin, but in its wet form, maybe on a paintbrush, because I know there's going to be gaps around this, right? Just due to that path of draw. You see how big of a gap there is right there? But that's what it takes to get this seated. So what I'll do is I'll just take a paintbrush with some of the same resin in its wet form, and I'll just brush some in there, okay? And then before curing it, I'll take this, press it down until it's fully seated, and then I'll throw them all in the curing oven together and let that cure. And now you've got a great study model. And if after the fact, when you come back, you still see that there's significant gaps, just flow a little more resin in there until you're back to more or less a full contour mandible. You'll never get these separated again, but that's okay, right? That's kind of what we're after really in this process. So want to look here, there's some errors in my mesh, which is not uncommon when you have really thin portions of that STL, so I'm going to repair those. Auto repair. And now I can save this as my mandible with sockets, or whatever you want to call it. Now one thing I'd say is this is going to be a ginormous print. It's going to use a ton of resin, and it's going to be a little bit wasteful. So what I'm going to do is just chop it down. I don't think there's anything this Ramus is going to contribute to their learning on, planning or surgically placing this mandible in the model. So let's don't print all that. I'm going to go to plane cut again, and I'm going to cut everything off above right there and discard that half. And then I also don't really need this portion. All right, much more conservative model to print, won't use near as much resin. And listen, we could still, after the fact, since this will be in clear resin, we could take some brightly colored PVS and inject through here, and you would see the nerve through this model. It would work out great. All right, so this is what I'm going to save. I'm going to inspect it one last time, make sure there's no holes. Looks good. I'll export this and call this final mandible with sockets. Now I can print this all as one solid piece, and it'll be pretty easy to just print this, seat it, and then I can just take a burr or something and just slice through there, and this whole part will fall away, and we're at the same end result, but I'll know I've seated it accurately. So again, consider that a freebie for learning Mesh Mixer. Okay, so we've already got that STL saved. That was our teeth and intraoral scan. We've got our mandible with sockets. So now let's print them. Okay, I'm going to do a little voiceover here because the audio had an issue, but what you're seeing now is the completed models. I printed the jaw in that clear resin, which is a softer resin that you can actually drill into, and I'll put the part number up on the screen here. So you can purchase that if you want to. And then the teeth have been printed in model resin. We just syringed a little bit of the same clear jaw resin into the sockets, pressed the teeth down into it, and then cured them together. So now you have a realistic, lifelike study jaw. It's got gingiva where there needs to be gingiva for sake of seating your guide. You could treatment plan this just like it were a real patient, and now carry out your model-based surgery. So with that, let's go ahead and look at actually doing the drilling on this, because this was the first time I tried it. I wanted to actually make sure it was able to be drilled on without chewing up my burrs, and so we'll look at that. Okay, here we go. Hopefully I'm in frame here. So much softer than the traditional resin. And again, this is that stuff that's kind of thermoplastic, so you wouldn't end up chewing up the drills. So now I'm going up a drill size. And we could just go all the way up in our drill sequence.
And I think this called for like a 5.0 implant. But as you can see, it's not going to be a problem to drill on this. So I can get you the name of this resin, and I think if you guys did this, and I could make you a tutorial video showing you how I make the teeth where I can insert them. But this is a really good demo model. Now this is not a real implant motor, so it's not got the most torque, but you know, this is just a lab motor that I stuck a E-burr into, or a into. But you can see that is as good a simulation as you're going to get. Now granted it wasn't guided, but it would be the exact same process if it were.
So that's the end of it. Sorry for the choppy video, but I'm splicing a bunch of stuff together. Again, this wasn't originally intended to be a going out to everyone tutorial. But you know, if you want to make study models, this is great for mock surgery. For courses, this is something we do so that patients can treatment plan a real CT and then actually do that same surgery on a model. You know, this video is way longer than that would have taken me normally. Typically this is a 10 to 15 minute job, especially once you've done it a couple of times. So anyways, maybe you found that useful. If nothing else, maybe you learned some mesh mixers. So hope it helped.